Hello, I'm Peter Higginbotham, and today I'm going to be talking about the treatment of children in the workhouse system. The typical attitude towards children was well illustrated by this quotation from the 1904 Poor Law Handbook. Pauperism is in the blood, and there's no more effectual means of checking its hereditary nature than by doing all in our power to bring up our pauper children in such a manner as to make them God-fearing, useful, and healthy members of society. In other words, parents who are living off the state passed that inclination on to their children, and children needed that tendency wrung out of them at an early age. As we saw in a previous presentation, from the start of the 17th century, the support of the poor was founded on what became known as the Old Poor Law. That was centred on the parish. Parishes could raise money from their householders, and that was used to support the poor, either through out relief or handouts, or later on through the provision of a residential workhouse. When it came to children, they could be apprenticed. In the case of boys, that would last until the age of 24, or for girls until they reached the age of 21 or got married. Children whose parents couldn't keep or maintain them, that's typically the illegitimate children or those who've been deserted, then they could be set to work. And children could form a significant part of the parish workhouse population. The treatment of children in a typical workhouse is well illustrated by this report from Bedford Workhouse in 1724. The children are to be instructed in civil and good behaviour, in reading, in knitting, spinning, sewing and other domestic activities, and that all of them are able to attend some place of religious worship on Sundays, and to be instructed morning and evening in their prayers. The boys and girls that can work are let out to local drapers to spin jersey, who pay them by the pound for their work, and when they're grown up they're bound out as apprentices. Before that, they're sent to a local charity or free school and taught to read and learn their catechism. So the children are educated, taught good behaviour and skills to equip them for adult life. Another institution linked to workhouse children was the baby farm. These were introduced in 1767 by Jonas Hanway's Act, and they were intended for workhouse children in particular. Conditions in London workhouses at that date were particularly poor, and it was decreed that children under 6 from the workhouse should be sent to school in the countryside at least 3 miles from the capital. And to ensure a basic quality of care, the maintenance of each child was to cost at least 2 shillings and 6pence a week. A very well-known example of a baby farm is the one described in Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. The parish authorities magnanimously and humanely resolved that Oliver should be farmed, in other words, dispatched to a branch workhouse some 3 miles off, where 20 or 30 other juvenile offenders against the poor laws rolled about the floor all day, without the inconvenience of too much food or too much clothing, under the parental superintendence of an elderly female, who received the culprits at and for the consideration of 7pence halfpenny per small head per week. 7pence halfpenny, of course, is a quarter of the 2 and 6pence a week that was decreed by Hanway's Act, so rather an inferior establishment where Charles Dickens placed young Oliver Twist. 1834 saw the overhaul of the existing parish-based poor relief system with the passing of the Poor Law Amendment Act, which became known as the New Poor Law. The new law revolved around a larger area of administration known as the Poor Law Union, and each of these new areas was run by a committee known as the Board of Guardians. Each union was expected to provide a large workhouse to serve its whole area. In these new union workhouses, the inmates were divided into 7 different categories. On the male side, there were 3 sections: aged or infirm men, able-bodied men and youths over 15, and youths and boys aged 7 to 14. Similarly, on the female side, there were aged and infirm women, able-bodied women and girls over 15, and girls 7 to 14. Children under 7 formed the final category. Each of these groups had its own section of the building, and they were segregated until they left the workhouse. Families were split up. However, children under 7 could live with their mothers in the women's wards, and the mothers were allowed to have reasonable access to their children at all times. Fathers or mothers in the same workhouse could request a supervised daily interview with their children in a room allocated for the purpose. In practice, that tended not to happen very much. Sunday afternoons was the time when a father or mother, but not both at the same time, could spend some time with their children. And children formed a large proportion of the workhouse population. In 1839, 43,000 out of the 89,000 total workhouse inmates were children. Children were educated in the workhouse for at least 3 hours a day, instructed in reading, writing, arithmetic, and the principles of Christian religion, and other instruction that may fit them for service and train them to the habits of usefulness, industry, and virtue. So, as in the parish workhouse, basic education, religious education, and training in useful skills for adult life, so that children wouldn't turn into paupers like their parents had done. They would be self-sufficient. Here's the daily routine for the boys at a large London workhouse, St Marylebone, in the 1840s. Up nice and early at 6, make beds, prayers, cleaning and washing. 7 o'clock, 45 minutes for gymnastics. 7:45 till 9, prayers, breakfast and play. In the morning, it's schoolwork, historical reading, mental arithmetic, tables, telling the time, grammar, parsing and dictation. 12 till 2, dinner and recreation, and in the afternoon, more schoolwork, writing in copybooks, arithmetic, reading, geography with maps. 6 o'clock supper, 8 o'clock more prayers, and retire to bed. Now what about the girls? A similar start to the day. Rise at 6, make beds, prayers, clean shoes, washing, prayers and religious instruction. Breakfast 8 till 9. In the morning, schoolwork, reading, spelling, tables, arithmetic, copybooks, dictation. 12:30 till 2, dinner and recreation, and in the afternoon, no more schoolwork, but needlework, knitting and domestic employment. Supper and recreation 5 till 6, and in the evening, whereas the boys had little much to do apart from eat their supper, for the girls it was needlework, knitting and domestic employment again. 8 o'clock prayers and retire to bed. Some interesting differences between the girls and the boys' routines. The girls were not given any history, geography, telling the time, grammar, and did no gymnastics in the morning. From 1847, workhouse schools were regularly inspected, and some of the comments from inspectors make interesting reading. The boys did not appear accustomed to being questioned, nor have acquired the habit of attention. To the question, who was Pontius Pilate? 2 boys answered, the Virgin Mary. Spelling, bad. The girls were ignorant, but appeared not quite so heedless as the boys. At another institution, the children here, as on former occasions, were deplorably ignorant. None could tell what country they lived in, or work a sum of any kind. And finally, the girls were in a low state. Africa and London were said to be 2 large towns in Yorkshire. These comments don't necessarily mean that the quality of teaching in workhouse schools was abominable. Children in workhouses often had no previous schooling and were in the workhouse often for quite short periods. So it's not surprising perhaps that when it came to being tested or examined, their performance was pretty abysmal. Discipline for workhouse children was strict, and there were 2 grades of offence that were distinguished. First of all, disorderly offences, minor offences, could result in a punishment of being placed on a diet of bread and potatoes for a meal or two. More serious offences were classed as refractory, and for those you could be punished both by the plain diet plus a period of solitary confinement in the refractory cell, as it was often referred. For very serious offences, flogging, corporal punishment, could be administered. There were some restrictions on the refractory cell. You couldn't be confined in a dark room or during the night if you were under the age of 12. Corporal punishment could only be carried out on boys and could only be carried out by the schoolmaster or the workhouse master. 2 hours had to have elapsed since the offence, so it couldn't be administered in the heat and anger of the moment. The rod that was used for beating boys had to be formally approved by the guardians before use, and flogging of boys was only applicable to those under 14. From the 1840s onwards, there were increasing efforts by the central authorities to persuade unions to house children away from the taint or bad influence of the workhouse. One of the first schemes that was proposed was the creation of separate or district schools, establishments that would serve workhouses over an area. These establishments educated children, but particularly provided them with industrial training to equip them for adult life. And the training included such things as textile work, carpentry, plumbing, shoemaking, tailoring, and so on. In some places, agricultural work was seen as the most useful skill, and for the girls, domestic work was seen as the main provision to equip them for life as a domestic servant. One of the largest institutions of this type was the Swinton School, set up in the 1840s by the Manchester Poor Law Union. And in London, the Central London District School at Hanwell in Middlesex served a number of London unions. This was the establishment where the film star Charlie Chaplin spent some time in the 1890s. By the 1870s, there was increasing criticism of district and separate schools, which had become disparagingly known as barrack schools. They were expensive to run, the children received little in the way of individual attention, and they were breeding grounds for infectious diseases such as ringworm and ophthalmia. In their place, there was a growing interest in what were referred to as cottage homes. These were constructed typically as a small village of houses and other buildings out in the countryside. And the children lived in what were called family groups, typically 20 odd children in each house under the charge of a house parent. The Cottage Homes development also had its own school, church, infirmary, workshops and so on. And again, industrial training was part of the regime in a Cottage Homes development. Cottage homes were also used by some of the major children's charities of the day, particularly Barnardo's and the National Children's Home. A typical Cottage Homes development was this one at Colchester, erected by the Salford Poor Law authorities. At the centre we have the children's houses arranged around a central area. We have the hospital, we have schools, we even have a swimming bath and workshops for the use of the children. Some of the buildings at Colchester still stand. Here are some of the children's houses. And on the left here we have the children's workshops, and on the right the swimming baths. There was also a swimming bath at the Banstead Cottage Homes site run by the Kensington and Chelsea School District. Also at Banstead, here are the boys at work in the shoemaking workshop. And like many Cottage Homes developments, Banstead had its own boys' military-style band. Apart from teaching the boys musical skills, it also provided a possible career opportunity. Many boys from these bands went on to have careers as military bandsmen. For the girls, though, domestic service was the most likely future destination, and that provided the focus of their industrial training. Cottage homes became popular, but they started to attract criticism. It was said that Cottage Homes children were living in a never land, and they weren't really being prepared for their future life in a town or a city. An alternative appeared in the form of scattered homes. These were devised at Sheffield in the 1890s. Scattered homes retained the family group concept of cottage homes, 20 or 30 children living in a house under the charge of a house parent. However, they lived in ordinary townhouses scattered around the suburbs of a town or city. Scattered home children attended local schools and mixed with the children of the neighbourhood. However, the homes were spread out so that they would never swamp a particular local school. Unions that adopted the scattered home system typically also set up a central receiving home to act as an admission centre for new arrivals and as a stores and administrative centre for the system. Here's one of the first scattered homes to be set up at Sheffield in the 1890s, just an ordinary house. The same building still standing today, and you would never know that it had once been a home for workhouse children. And here's an example of a central home, the receiving home set up by the Leeds Union in 1901 with accommodation for around 40 children. You may occasionally meet the term small homes. This really came into use at around the time of the First World War. Typically it refers to an establishment somewhere between a cottage home and a scattered home, typically a large house with 20, 30, 40 children in it. And it's a term mostly adopted by smaller unions with relatively few children to deal with, a one-off home to house those children. Just to give you an idea of the usage of these various types of home, a survey in 1914 recorded that around 115 unions, that's about 18% of the unions in operation, were running cottage or small homes. Around 90 unions were running scattered homes, and some were using a mixture of the two. In 1913, it was decreed that there would be no children residing as long-term workhouse inmates after 1915. The arrival of the First World War put a delay on that happening, but by 1920 there were indeed virtually no children residing in workhouses. Another type of establishment, introduced in 1862, were known as certified schools. These allowed the workhouse authorities to board out children in privately run establishments. And there were various attractions to the workhouse authorities in doing this. First of all, they were particularly useful for Roman Catholic children. If these were placed in a certified school, it meant that the workhouse didn't have to make its own special provision for them. The Catholic community were also very keen to remove Catholic children from workhouses where it was believed that they would lose their faith. Certified schools were also useful for training older girls who were about to enter domestic service, and again it meant the workhouse didn't have to provide that training itself. And for small unions with relatively few children to take care of, then certified schools provided a useful alternative to the union having to set up and run its own establishment. For girls, of course, a certified school typically meant learning domestic skills to prepare them for domestic service. For the boys, an alternative appeared in the form of naval training ships. A number of these were set up around the coasts of Britain, and boys could be sent here from workhouses from about the age of 11, where they were given a thorough training in naval skills, and many of them went on to have future careers in the Royal or Merchant Navies. Typical of these was the Indefatigable, which was based on the River Mersey at New Ferry near Birkenhead. And, as at Cottage Homes, naval training ships invariably had their own boys' band, many of whose members would go on to careers as bandsmen. This is the band above the training ship Empress, moored on the Clyde near Glasgow. The placing of poor children into apprenticeship greatly decreased after 1834 compared to how it had been under the old Poor Law. This was largely due to an acknowledgement that apprenticeship had been greatly abused by local tradesmen who exploited young children for their own benefit. The reputation of apprenticeship was also considerably damaged by a report in 1842 which showed that young children in the West Riding of Yorkshire and South Staffordshire had been apprenticed, so-called, in mines where they'd worked for up to 16 hours a day. And the report listed by name some of the children involved. Particularly shocking was the case of Thomas Townend, who at the age of 5 was sent on trial to work in a mine. However, he was sent back after 16 days, presumably because he hadn't been able to cope with what was expected of him. And here's a graphic illustration of the heavy work that these young boys were being put to in the underground mine shafts, hauling heavy trucks full of coal. Another way that workhouses could provide accommodation for the children in their care was through boarding out, or fostering as we would now call it. The use of boarding out by the workhouses began in the 1850s, although boarding out itself goes back much further than that. It was applied to orphans and abandoned children, children whose parents were no longer around for one reason or another. And it required careful supervision. Workhouses were handing over their charges to private individuals who needed careful vetting and supervision. Boarding out became very popular. By 1900, over half of the unions in the country were making use of boarding out. And it would have been even more, but the supply of foster parents was often not enough to meet the demand that existed. And boarding out could be over quite long distances. Children could be placed many, many miles away from their original home, beyond the bounds of the union that was running the system. Here's a typical boarding out agreement. This is between the Sheffield Poor Law Union and Isabella Crosby of Cockermouth in Cumbria, a long distance away from Sheffield. This is for the care of Albert Kitchin, aged 7 years. And the agreement goes on to give details of what is to be provided for Albert while in the care of his foster family. To give you an idea of the use of these different sorts of accommodation, here's a report from 1922. At that date, over 64,000 children were living in institutions directly run by the Poor Law authorities, and these included 9,000 or so in scattered homes, nearly 11,000 in cottage homes, over 5,000 in separate and district schools, over 6,000 in other homes, and 749 boys placed on training ships. The authorities were also boarding out almost 10,000 children, with 17% of those being placed outside their home area. And nearly 9,500 children were being placed in non-Poor Law homes, independently run homes, of which 6,000 and so were in the 217 operating certified schools at that date. In all of these cases, the children involved usually underwent an initial short stay at their local workhouse in order to be processed and decided what was the most suitable accommodation for them to be passed on to. The fate of many workhouse children, however, was emigration to countries such as Canada or Australia. In 1834, following the advent of the new Poor Law, it became possible to emigrate poor children to some British colony not lying between the tropics, as it was phrased. Another scheme launched in 1848 was widely taken up by the workhouse authorities in Ireland, which was then at the height of the Great Famine, and thousands of girls from Irish workhouses were emigrated, with Quebec in Canada being the most popular destination. Emigration was also very popular with children's charities of the Victorian era, and it was largely privately operated. The arrangements for taking children to Canada and distributing them to new homes or employment was largely done by individuals such as Maria Rye and Annie McPherson, the two most well-known names in the field. A report in 1874, however, made criticisms of the arrangements made for children in Canada. They were not being tracked properly or supervised, and some of them were being mistreated by their new homes or employers. Following that, there was a bit of a decline in emigration for a while, but it recovered, and by the end of the 19th century, over 36,000 pauper children had been emigrated to other countries. And here's a typical scene aboard one of the emigration ships, taking a party of boys to their new lives in Canada. So when did the workhouse system come to an end? Well, an important date in that process was the 1st of April 1930. That was when the Boards of Guardians, the committees that had run the workhouse system since 1834, were finally abolished, and their responsibilities were taken over by county and borough councils. Under council control, many workhouses were redesignated as public assistance institutions, or in some cases as hospitals. When it came to children's homes, however, many of them, probably most of them, continued as before under council control. And in 1948, councils were given the responsibility for the care of all children in need, not just those who were poor and destitute. If you want to know more about this subject, then take a look at my websites, workhouses.org.uk and childrenshomes.org.uk, where you'll find lots of information about individual workhouse children's homes and also children's run by other bodies such as charities. And you may also be interested in taking a look at some of the books I've written. All of these will be available from your usual book supplier.